Are you podcasting yet? If not, it is a huge opportunity, not just for the sake of the podcast content, but all the content you can get out of the podcast. It can be great content for your website. It can be great content for your email newsletter. It can be great content for social media. Get the most out of your podcast. So if you're not yet podcasting, we're gonna talk about how to podcast in this episode, and we're gonna talk about how you squeeze the most out of your podcast to get engagement across all of your digital platforms. So let's dig into this video, and I want to give you some how-tos of squeezing your podcast to get the most out of it across all platforms. Hey there, if we haven't met yet, I'm Nils Smith, your social media guide. Today, we're talking about podcasting, and I love podcasting. And whether you have a podcast yet or not, you can have a monologue podcast or a conversational dialogue podcast. It doesn't matter. There are opportunities for you to squeeze that podcast and get the most, not just out of the full length podcast, but out of the clips, out of the newsletter opportunities, out of the website engagement opportunities for SEO. We'll dig into it all. So the first thing you got to think about is, how are you going to capture your podcast? And maybe it's speaking directly to a camera and a microphone, but the tool that I highly recommend when it comes to capturing your podcast, and this is what I do for both monologue podcast and for conversation interview style podcast, and that's Riverside. I'm going to leave a link to all of the software recommendations in the description below, so you can go check that out. But yeah, Riverside is one of the best tools out there because of the way it captures high quality video and high quality audio. And then it has lots of other features to help you transcribe that podcast, to export that podcast. And so if you're looking for a great way to capture your podcast and you're not yet using Riverside, I highly recommend it. It's a low cost solution that gives you a high quality product on the other side. So step one, you gotta capture your podcast, but you're not squeezing it yet. So we'll get to those steps and how you squeeze it, but capture it well. And Riverside is a great way to do that. So the first way that you squeeze the podcast is in your distribution of that full length podcast. And if you're not doing video yet, I cannot encourage you enough to do video, because the number one place that people are consuming podcasts today is YouTube. Now, Apple Podcasts has historically been the go-to place for podcasts. And then we saw Spotify and so many other platforms pop up and prioritize podcasting, especially from an audio standpoint. But I would encourage you both capture it in video and audio so that you can get the most out of YouTube. YouTube is the second largest search engine of the world. It's where so many people are consuming, especially long form content like a podcast. So you want to distribute on YouTube as a platform, if at all possible. And so get set up on a podcast hosting platform with your audio. We recommend Libsyn, Libsyn. It's a great solution that we've been using for years. It was actually existed before even Apple Podcast existed. And so it's a great steady host, but there's lots of good other hosting solutions that are like $5 to $10 a month. It's a low cost need. And then you can create that RSS feed that can go to the different audio podcast networks. And then you need to set up your YouTube channel where you can then distribute your videos. And YouTube packaging is one of the most important things. You got to create your title in your description. But the thing that's going to affect how many people watch it more than anything else is your thumbnail. And so having an eye-catching thumbnail that's going to get people, when YouTube recommends your video, to hit play is going to be based on how appealing that thumbnail is to get them to click. And so the tool that I would recommend to create a high quality thumbnail for your distribution of your podcast is Canva. And now Canva is a popular tool that so many people know already, but one of the things Canva has now created is Canva AI, which is an upgrade from a basic Canva account, but it can really help you create those really compelling, high quality thumbnails. Now, the other opportunity you have, and I'd recommend testing as well if you don't feel like you're good enough on Canva to create your thumbnails, is just go to Fiverr.com and pay somebody $5, $10 to create thumbnails for you for your YouTube videos. And that investment of, whether it's your time with a software like Canva or it's paying somebody $5 or $10 to create high quality, creative, attention grabbing thumbnails for your videos, it's worth that investment to get more views on your podcast content. So distribute your content to all the audio networks and put it on YouTube. So the first part of the squeeze is making sure your distribution is not just to Apple Podcasts, but it's also to Spotify, it's also to Stitcher, it's also to all those audio podcast platforms, Audible. is now a popular place for people to consume podcasts, but YouTube with your video side of the podcast is also a big opportunity. The second place that you want to make sure you're distributing and squeezing the most out of your podcast is your website. You want to post basically a place where people can consume both the video, embedding your YouTube video into your website, the audio, embedding your Libsyn embed audio player or whatever podcast platform you have there, and then have show notes and have a transcription of your podcast there on your website. And what this does is this is actually all of those words that are then on your website are searchable by Google, and it's a way to get more traffic to your website. And so by squeezing the most out of your podcast is distributing it to all the podcast platforms, but it's also distributing it to Google for Google to then index everything that's on that podcast and for it to be a new traffic driver to your website. So squeeze your podcast by distributing it effectively and integrating it into your website. Typically that's done in basically the blog format on your website, with each new episode being a blog post that then is searchable and can engage people right there on your website. A tool that I highly recommend when it comes to your website optimization is listener.fm, and I've got a link in the description below that's an affiliate link. So if you want to support this channel, if you want to click that link, it'll just help us in a little way. But listener.fm will basically take your audio file and then create your blog post for your website from your podcast content. It will create the description that you need, and basically kind of all of those output needs that you have in distributing that podcast to get that SEO juice. So as we talk about squeezing that podcast, Google search is a big way for people to find you on the internet, and every word you say in your podcast is now searchable when you squeeze the most out of that podcast and have it on your website and searchable through Google searches. And so part of squeezing it is distributing it to YouTube, distributing your podcast to all the audio platforms, and then also distributing it on your website. And this is a great way to get people to your website to then find other things on your website as well as engaging with the podcast itself. The third part of the podcast squeeze is your email newsletter. So often I think we feel like I'm trying to build my email list, but what do I send them? I don't want to just send them a bunch of sales emails. Well, a great thing to send them is your podcast. It's a great excuse to email your list on a regular basis. And ideally you're releasing a new podcast about once a week. That's a great rhythm of sending people updates of your email newsletter. You can go to nilssmith.com and get on my email newsletter, and this video is being sent to my entire email list. And so I release a new video about once a week and I send them a link to this video. And so with your podcast, and I have another podcast called Social Media Church, we do the same thing. Every week we release a new episode and we email our newsletter. And so we're barely ever sending sales newsletters. We're almost always sending new content, new value to our email list. And so your podcast is a great way to engage that list and sharing with them another great free resource that's available to them. It's a good value add to your email newsletter. And so using listener.fm will help you write that email newsletter, but just go ahead and include that in your email rhythms as a high value to that list, and getting more traffic to the podcast, which then is going to shoot it up the charts. So the more views gets on YouTube, YouTube is going to say this is valuable. We're going to show it to more people. The more listens it gets on Apple Podcast is going to say this is more valuable. We're going to recommend it to more people. So as you begin and continue that podcast squeeze, you want to make sure you're distributing it well, make sure your SEO is done well on your website, and then you want to make sure that you're taking the people that are already trust you and have signed up for your email list, and you're letting them know about this new content that you've now made available. So part of the squeeze is your email newsletter. Now, the final part of the podcast squeeze is probably the most popular part, and maybe even why you started a podcast to begin with, is it's a great way to create content for social media. People are always like, what do I post on social media? Well, post clips of your podcast. And so out of every podcast episode, it's likely that you can get 3, 4, maybe 5 clips that you can easily post on TikTok and Facebook and Instagram and LinkedIn and all the different platforms. And so whether it's a video clip, whether it's a quote that you pull out of that podcast, squeeze the most out of it so that you're getting content for your social media channels that isn't just sales pushing different things, it's value add. And so maybe in that 30-second clip, something catches their attention to where they go and then listen to the whole episode. The tool I'd recommend using when it comes to AI and getting the squeeze out of your podcast is Minvo, M-I-N-V-O, and I've got a link again in the description below, but Minvo is a great platform that you can just put your YouTube video right into the Minvo platform, and then it will just automatically generate and recommend about 10 different clips for social media right out of your podcast itself. So you don't have to go through the effort of finding it. It'll then recommend it, and then you can pick and choose and then edit, make kind of micro edits right there on the podcast clip itself. And then you can use that podcast clip to then link to and promote the full podcast episode. And so that's the podcast squeeze. That's how we want to take content that we create one time and then squeeze the most out of it, both on our distribution of our podcast content on our website for SEO, to our email newsletter, and for social media. And so with one piece of content, you're able to get now dozens of pieces of content for our multiple digital platforms. So that's the podcast squeeze. I would love to know, are there other things we can do to squeeze the most out of podcast? Also, if you have a podcast, go ahead and link that in the comments. I'd love to check out your podcast. If this helps at all, and if you want help with your podcast squeeze, it's what we do at Amplify Social Media. We help people that are creating content get the most out of that content, optimizing it for distribution, amplifying their voice to reach more people. And so if you want help with these things, we'd love to help. Reach out to us at amplifysocial.media. Thanks so much for watching. We'll talk to you again on the next episode.